Good day, everyone, and welcome to week 2. And for this week, we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of welfare economics. So, welfare economics is an area in economics that has gained much more importance in not only the literature and in research, but also in society in general. And this comes about because of the changes to our demographics, to our country, to globalization, of course. And so with globalization, with immigration, with the changes that are taking place in the world and in our country, the importance of providing goods and services for citizens has grown with population, of course, and with all of these different changes in migration and in demographics, etc. And so how we allocate resources, goods and services, etc., has become much more of an important and driving factor. And you hear it all the time when you hear politicians and elected officials talk about the provision of goods and services and what should be provided and how much should be provided, etc. So, as we did for week 1, we are going to focus our discussion on the focus questions, right? And for this week, we are studying chapters 3, 4, and 5. So, chapter 3 starts with a discussion on market efficiency, right? We have our first 3 questions. Okay, so question number 3.1 asks, what do economists mean when they say the economy is efficient? This is an important question because many times economists refer to efficiency, and people, in fact, you might hear the word efficiency being thrown around, and it might mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. So what do economists mean when they refer to efficiency? Well, it has to do with the idea of that was first introduced by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. If you recall from week 1, Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand and how this through a seemingly invisible hand, buyers and sellers would come together and produce the most efficient allocation or distribution of goods and services in the economy. Well, if you think about that idea and then you bring it to the present a little bit, not 2020, but if you bring it to the ideas and theories of the Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, okay? Vilfredo Pareto was an Italian economist who came up with some very, very intuitive theories about distribution and about efficiency. And in particular, when he referred to efficiency, and when we in economics refer to efficiency, we're talking about exchange efficiency, production efficiency, and product mix efficiency. So what do these mean? Well, that takes us to focus question number 3.2. What conditions have to be satisfied if markets are to be efficient? So let's look at a first condition. First one is exchange efficiency, okay? And exchange efficiency has to do with how much do I consume versus the other person in the economy consuming. So if we have an economy like the one we show here on the Edgeworth box, you have Friday on one side and Crusoe on the other, and these two individuals make up the economy. And they can consume any variations, any combinations of apples and oranges. But they come to this point, a point like E, which is a point where they are both happy with the amount of oranges and apples that they consume. Okay? And at that point, one consumes more apples than the other, but that doesn't mean that one is less happy than the other. They are both happiest at that point, at which their marginal rate of substitution is equal. So that would be a point where exchange efficiency would be obtained. So that's exchange efficiency. Now, the second condition proposed by Pareto is production efficiency. And production efficiency has to do with the marginal rate of technical substitution, which also has to be equal, but not this time by firms and not individuals, right? And so this is, by the way, usually found in competitive markets. And the reason for that is because the marginal rate of technical substitution is equal for all firms in competitive markets, because competitive markets are markets where firms are price takers, not price setters. So the prices in the market are equilibrium prices. They are competitive markets, and because they are that, every firm has to deal with those prices. They don't set a price, they take price. So in competitive markets, you find productive efficiency. And then the third element proposed by Pareto is product mix efficiency. And this has to do with the allocation of those goods and services in the economy. Okay? So the demand for apples and oranges, for example, matching the supply of apples and oranges, right? So it is that bundle of goods that is the most efficient based on the demand of the citizens of the economy and the supply from the firms. And this condition is met where the marginal rate of marginal rate of transformation must equal the marginal rate of substitution. Okay, it is at that intersection where, not the intersection, but the tangency, okay, between the production possibilities curve of apples and oranges and the indifference curves of the citizens. Or in our example, it would be the economy of Crusoe and Friday. Okay, so question number 3. What role does competition play in ensuring efficiency? So now we're getting at what actions does government have to ensure that we reach an efficient market. And perhaps the best way to explain this question, or to answer this question, is through the fundamental theorems of welfare economics. Okay, and these theorems illustrate the idea of no cash left on the table, and that's a saying that some people have, as you can see in this table, right? The idea is that when you don't leave any cash on the table, there are no opportunities for improving the trade or the condition, right? And so when there is no cash on the table, everybody that was on the table that had cash or that had a claim to the cash took whatever cash was represented the most and the best possible for that person. So that's that idea. And where do we find this condition? Well, according to the fundamental theorems of welfare economics, we say that every competitive economy is Pareto efficient, right? And of course, these are theories, right? Obviously, in practice, we see many examples where that is not the case. But in theory, every competitive economy is Pareto efficient. That means that there is no cash left on the table. And then the second theorem says that every Pareto efficient resource allocation can be attained through a competitive market mechanism. And so, in other words, it can be obtained through the price mechanism with the appropriate initial redistribution. And we'll talk about the importance of that concept of the initial redistribution here in the next few slides. All right, so let's go on to chapter 4, which discusses market failure. And if you recall from our lecture in week 1, we briefly introduced the concept of market failure and the idea that markets fail, but sometimes they fail because governments fail, right? So let's look at market failure in depth. So we have focus question 4.1 asks, what are the principal reasons why markets fail to produce efficient outcomes? Well, There's many reasons, right? But it comes down to one fundamental reason, and according to economists, it has to do with property rights, okay? Now, what do we mean by property rights? Well, property rights are those rights that give us an entitlement to a property, a title of ownership to a property, right? But when property rights are not clearly established or they are not well defined, we end up with a situation which is often known as the tragedy of the commons, okay? And what's the tragedy of the commons? Well, the tragedy of the commons is this idea in economics that comes from the time of the English manor, right, where you had think about the 19th century England, right, and you had the manor and these commons, right, common land where cows would graze, right, and so the tragedy of the commons is as follows. So you have one farmer who owned a cow, and he had his cow grazing in the commons, in the land. And so another farmer said, you know what, I'm going to buy a cow, and I'm going to have my cow graze. And so she bought a cow. And then a third farmer moved in, and he bought 2 cows. And then a fourth farmer said, you know what, they have 2 cows, and the other couple of farmers have a cow each, so I'm going to buy 3 cows. Well, you get the point, right? You begin to see that before you know it, you have this commons filled with cows. And with every additional cow, you reduce the amount of land available to graze to the point where, unless there is a limit placed, in theory, you're going to have the land be destroyed because of overgrazing, and none of the cows are going to be able to survive. And that's the tragedy of the commons, that without clearly established property rights and without the ability to enforce those property rights through law or through contracts, you end up with the tragedy of the commons, where everybody is an owner, nobody is an owner, so to speak, right? So that's the reason why those situations happen. Okay, focus question number 4.2 asks, what role does government play in making it possible for markets to work at all? So yet another question asking about the role of government. Well, government, from our lecture in week 1, we talked about government's role and what its legitimate role. Why does government even exist, right? What are the purposes of government? And one purpose, as far as economics is concerned, is to correct market failure. In economics, we call that internalizing the externalities, internalizing the market failures, right? So what does this mean? Well, if we think about some of the key market failures that take place in the economy, for example, in perfect competition, a company like Apple, right? A company like Apple has tremendous power over the market for smartphones, right? For data, for social media, right? And so, is the question of whether they enjoy monopoly power. That may be the case. It may not be the case. That's left to the courts to decide. But at least we can consider the question, right? So in perfect competition. Then you have public goods, right? Public goods like, for example, education, right? The government's role is to correct a market failure. Perhaps the higher education has produced a market failure where those individuals who cannot afford higher education are being left behind. And so what does the government do to try and correct those market failures? Well, it may provide scholarships, it may provide grants and low interest rate loans and such, right, to try and correct these market failures or market imperfections. And then you have something like externalities, right? Like the externality that is produced through cigarettes, for example, tobacco products, right? We know that these are dangerous and unhealthy. They cause cancer and other conditions, other diseases. And so what does the government seek to do? The government seeks to curb the consumption and the production of these goods and services. Well, these are goods, but of these goods, because they generate these negative externalities to society. So yet another reason for the government's role is to eliminate or reduce the negative externalities caused by some products. Conversely, right, the government seeks to promote those products that produce positive externalities, right? Like, for example, student loans, right? Student loans are an example of an incomplete market, because student loans are given to students regardless of their credit rating. And as for the federal loans, right? I mean, if you ask for a loan for a car or a house, your credit rating will determine your eligibility. But when it comes to Title IV funding, credit rating is not considered. And so you have an incomplete market because you are essentially lending money to students who may not be able to pay it back. You also don't have perfect information as far as their ability to pay it back, because you don't know what these students are going to study, right? So a student that majors in IT or in engineering may be in a better position to pay back his or her loans than a student who majors in, say, Spanish or English, right? Which are great majors, but they are not at the top of the list as far as the majors that generate the most out of college, right? So this would constitute an incomplete market. And then you have something like imperfect information, right? The FDA, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Food and Drug Administration, these are government institutions that seek to curb or protect citizens from imperfect information having to do with medication or with a food, right, a product. And so the idea is that this asymmetry that exists in as far as the information that's available is reduced by the information that is publicly provided by the government. And then lastly, the unemployment and other macroeconomic disturbances, right? These are failures that occur where the economy simply, falls off the tracks, right? It doesn't function in the way that it's supposed to. There's a saying that says that nothing is certain except death and taxes. You can add recessions to that, because recessions are a thing that is almost inevitable. You have a business cycle, and the business cycle includes expansions and it includes contractions, and so it's just a matter of when and how long those expansions and contractions are going to be. So in a period of, for example, of contraction, you're going to have high unemployment. And so how do you internalize that? How do you address that unemployment? Well, perhaps by lowering the interest rate to stimulate economic activity. Perhaps by expanding the money supply to get more money into the economy, and perhaps people being able to borrow, and governments and businesses to expand more and perhaps hire more workers, right? And so this is where the government would come in to try and fix these externalities. All right. Why might the government intervene in the market's allocation of resources even when it is Pareto efficient? Okay. What are merit goods, and what is government's role in redistribution? Now, these questions are not easy questions, folks, because we're talking now about what ought to be, right? The normative approach to economics. And normative approach is different with everybody, right? Everybody has his or her own way of looking at the world and worldview and what is best and what is the common good, right? And so it's not easy to come up with answers to these questions. So for example, when you have something like Medicaid or food stamps, right? These are, going back to our question here, why might the government intervene in the market allocation of resources even when it is Pareto efficient? All right, so even when it is Pareto efficient, for example, remember the conditions of Pareto efficiency, where you can't make somebody worse off without making somebody, you can't make somebody better off without making somebody worse off. That's Pareto efficiency, right? But does that mean that everybody is doing well? And the answer is not is no. Yeah. The fact that you can't make somebody else better off without making somebody else worse off doesn't mean that that person that is worse off is doing well, right? Or the person that is doing better, the person that is doing okay wouldn't want to be better, right? And so the government provides certain goods and services that will result in what we call sometimes Pareto improvements, okay? Trying to redistribute the starting position for people, to try and give them a helping hand, right? Push them in the right direction, provide some assistance, so that by doing so, they will at some point be able to achieve a better condition, right? One of my favorite pictures when we talk about efficiency and Pareto efficiency and issues of equity and equality is this famous little picture here with the three little boys who are trying to watch the ball game, right? And if you look at that, you know, when you think about equality versus equity, the left is equality of, if you look at it, it is equality, right? Everybody has one crate to watch the game, but obviously the little guy on the right is unable to watch the game even with his crate, right? And so the picture on the right shows that if the tall guy on the left gives gives the crate to the little guy, then he will be able to watch the game and everybody's happy. And it makes sense, right? If you think about this in the context of our government and of our system today, yeah, it makes sense, right? We all want everybody to have a seat at the table. We want the little guy to be able to watch the ball game as much as the tall guy. The problem is, how do you get there? That's really the question. Nobody here, and most people will not question that we seek that second picture instead of the first picture. The problem is, do you force and take away the box from the tall guy to give it to the little guy, or does government find ways to finance taking that box and giving it to the little guy, right? And of course, there's arguments on both sides, right? Because that's redistributing the wealth. But that's what government does, right? And it's not perfect. And some people are always going to be upset by it, and some people are going to be happy with it. But the idea, at least, is to find a more equitable distribution of goods and resources so that once this initial redistribution takes place, then you're on your own. Then it's up to you, right, to be able to keep that Pareto efficient allocation. Right? And this is why we have Medicaid, which is health insurance for those folks that have a limited income, right, for the poor, and things like food stamps, right? Food stamps provide assistance for individuals who have low income, right, and who qualify. But the idea is not to continue giving food stamps for these individuals forever. The idea that government has is to provide assistance, right? It's food assistance, food and nutrition assistance, so that these individuals are able to get themselves going with a little help from the state, so that they can then, through the proper channels and the proper decisions and behavior, will be able to put themselves in better positions to sustain themselves and be able to meet their own needs without the assistance of government, right? That's the hope, at least. Okay, question 4.4. What is the market failure approach to the role of government? And what are the alternative perspectives in thinking about the role in government? Okay, so what is the market failure approach to the role of government? Well, it's simple. The market failure approach is a normative approach, and it has to do with the idea that government ought to do this. Government ought to provide welfare. Government ought to increase the minimum wage, for example. And if you look at in this picture, the minimum wage argument is a normative approach argument. It is seeking to correct what many consider a market failure, where individuals who make minimum wage are unable to pay for their needs because their wages are so low. But here's the question. By doing that, are you really going to produce a Pareto efficient allocation? Because by raising the minimum wage, you are doing several things. First, you are creating inflation pressure, upward pressure on all prices, not just the minimum wage, but all prices. So that the tendency for prices to go up will be great, which means the real incomes of not only the low income earners, but all the earners, the real income will be reduced. Real wages actually are reduced. Second, by increasing the price of labor, which is the minimum wage, artificially, and not letting the market decide, you are essentially imposing a tax on labor. And if you impose a tax on labor and employers of that labor, what ends up happening is you reduce the demand for labor, especially for minimum wage earners. So you might have a few happy minimum wage earners with a high minimum wage, but you're going to have more people at minimum wage unemployed because the employers simply cannot afford to hire all the workers at a higher wage, right? And third, for those that do stay hired, those workers are going to have to work they're going to have to work a lot longer, right? And which can lead to burnout and other health issues and situations, right? Less time with the kids, less time with the family, all right? So there's all these negative impacts that take place, that happen with increasing the minimum wage. Not to say that it's not a good thing for some, but when we think about these approaches, right, like a normative approach, like a market failure approach, we have to be very careful, because sometimes the cure becomes worse than the disease when it comes to trying to fix a market failure. All right, we go on to chapter 5. Chapter 5 talks about public goods and publicly provided private goods, right? And so before we start on our focus questions, just to kind of get us into the idea of public goods, right? Public goods are not necessarily goods provided by the government, okay? So we should not confuse a publicly provided good or a good that the state provides with a public good in the context of economics, because as we will see here in the next few slides, the conditions and for public goods have sometimes nothing to do with who provides them. All right. So, focus question 5.1. What distinguishes public goods, those that are typically provided by government, from privately provided goods, Okay, and what do economists mean by pure public good? All right, so the classic example, the economic textbook example of a public good is the lighthouse, the famous lighthouse, right? And why is the lighthouse a public good? Well, because if you think about the function, the purpose of a lighthouse is to light, right, or to light up the night, to let ships know that they are close to the shore, and to provide them with a guide, right, in the middle of the night, so that they don't crash into the seabed, right? So, but why is it a public good? And why is it a pure public good? Well, it's because it is non-excludable and non-rival in consumption, right? Non-excludable and non-rival are the two properties of public goods. And in the case of the lighthouse, you don't have to pay, you don't have to be a citizen of that town or that country that has the lighthouse. You don't have to pay a cent for it. If you're a ship in the middle of the ocean, you can benefit from the light just as much as a ship that would pay for the lighthouse, right? So it's unable to exclude anybody from benefiting from that good. And also the rivalness, right? You're also, the fact that you are seeing the light doesn't take away from another ship to see the light. So in terms of rivalness, it is non-rival in consumption. On the other hand, when you look at a good like, for example, pizza, right, is excludable and rival in consumption. And how is it? First of all, let's think about excluding. Well, how is it excludable? Well, it's excludable in the sense that if you don't pay for it, you don't consume it, right? So if you don't pay for the pie, you don't get to eat it. And as far as rivalness, it is also rival in the sense that if somebody takes a bite from your pizza pie, that is rivaling your consumption of the pie. So pizza is a private good, and it would be rival and excludable. But on the other hand, we look at national defense, right? Look at this gentleman here, this soldier, and you think about national defense, it's also a pure public good, but it has one exception, okay? But if you are an American citizen, and if you live in fact, you don't have to be an American citizen. If you live in the United States, national defense becomes a pure public good for you because it is non-excludable and non-rival, meaning that the defense is provided for the entire American Republic, right? The entire 48 states and Hawaii and Alaska, and I guess to an extent Puerto Rico and the other commonwealths, right? The other U.S. territories. So for them, the defense is unexcludable. Everybody that lives in these places benefits from that. And as far as rivalness, somebody in Ohio benefiting from it does nothing to somebody in New York or somebody in Florida or somebody in California, right? So for those that live in the U.S. or are protected by American defense, it is a pure public good. All right, why will private markets undersupply pure public goods? Okay, what is the free rider problem? Well, this question, question 5.2, kind of gives away the answer. The answer to the first question is the second question. It has to do with the free rider problem. Okay, but before we talk about the free rider problem, let's think about some of these conditions or these properties that public goods have, right? You know, public goods, we said that the reason why they are not allocated correctly sometimes has to do with the property rights. They are not clearly established or they are not well defined, right? So who owns, like for example, if we think about, for example, in the United Nations, right, in the world, who owns the seas? Who owns the sky? Is it okay to pollute? Because if everybody owns it, but nobody owns it, so you see, it's not clearly established, right? If you think about China, for example, polluting its air, the air doesn't stay there. The pollution doesn't stay on top of China. It goes all over the world. The same thing with the US or any other country. So you don't have clearly established property rights. It's also impossible or extremely expensive to exclude anybody from benefiting those property, from benefiting those public goods, right? Like world peace, right? Or protections from nuclear war, for example, right? And of course, with public goods, we seek to promote those goods that produce these positive externalities, like world peace, like law and order, like security. But we also have goods that produce negative externalities. So how do you control those, right? And so it becomes a problem because of this notion of the free rider. And it has to do with the inability to charge everybody for his or her use, or to exclude everybody from enjoying the good, right? And I'll give you an example. Think about your neighborhood, or any neighborhood, or this neighborhood that we see here. It's a beautiful neighborhood, and we have a neighborhood with very beautiful houses, and the stars and stripes, and it looks wonderful, and manicured gardens, and it's wonderful, right? But think about what would happen if one of these neighbors wasn't so keen on keeping his house nice and tidy and clean and painted, and his house and his flag and his garden. Think about if the house was all beaten down, right, in that neighborhood. Well, the fact that that neighbor has decided to do that, okay, but the other neighbors have decided to keep their homes. Well, their homes are producing higher property value for the neighborhood. And so this one neighbor who may not be so keen to keep his or her house as nice is benefiting, is free riding from the decisions and the economic decisions, which are investment and whatever, the costs of that, to keep those houses nice. And so this one neighbor is free riding from these other neighbors, right? But it would be very difficult to exclude that neighbor from benefiting from these houses and the nice houses, because you are not going to run your house down because the other neighbor is doing it. But at the same time, you're very limited, unless there are some town ordinances or something, right? Like a neighborhood, an enclosed neighborhood or something, where it requires the neighbor to keep up the house. But unless you have that, property rights are not clear. And so he has the right to keep his house however he or she wants, right? Sometimes it becomes too expensive. It could be expensive in the way of litigation or simply enforcement, right? And so you have these problems of the free rider. And in something like healthcare, for example, when it comes to emergency, the emergency care that's provided at hospitals, right? It's good that you have these, but at the same time, is it creating a problem because of the free riders will not pay for insurance and will not seek to improve their health conditions because they know that they can always go to the emergency room if they're having chest pains or what have you, right? And so that's why it becomes so difficult for government to be able to internalize these externalities and to be able to provide public goods because of the problem with the free rider. Okay, what are the special characteristics and challenges of global public goods, right? So like national or domestic public goods, global public goods are pretty much the same, but they have a different motive. Because it's global, it takes on a different perspective, right? Geopolitics and world collective action, if you will, right? International organizations, countries like the United Nations, the Organization of American States in America. They seek to promote multilateral agreements and actions that are for the benefit and the betterment of the world, of humanity, of the entire world. But it doesn't always work because of property rights, because of unclearly established property rights, because of things like national sovereignty. Okay, like for example, we believe that world peace and and keeping the equilibrium and the balance in the world as far as world peace is a public good. It's something that we all seek and would like to have more of. But how do you keep a country, for example, like North Korea, from making decisions about its national defense and developing a bomb, for example, a nuclear arsenal, right? They have the sovereignty. They are sovereign. They are a sovereign nation, and so these issues of national defense and of world affairs are not always easily managed because of sovereignty, because of the differences in culture, in religion, right, which generate a different perceptions as far as what is a public good and what goods we all collectively want to promote and which ones we don't want to promote or we prefer not to promote. So why do governments provide goods that are not pure public goods? Okay. Well, it has to do again with thinking about the role of government, right? Society and the market do not always produce the most desired outcome. We conclude that the free market and that the ideas proposed by Adam Smith and efficiency are all best found in free markets, right? In the free market mechanism, the price mechanism, right? This is what produces the most efficient allocation of resources and the conditions for living conditions and welfare conditions for the population. But it's not always the case. It doesn't always guarantee the best outcome. And the reason for that is because people will do what people will do, right? And governments will do what they will do, right? And so when you have something like, for example, participatory democracy or inclusiveness or human rights, these we can all agree that these are public goods. We all want more of these, right? And if you think about something like, let's look at here, something like the rule of law, okay, or transparency, right? Think about transparency and how transparency is non-excludable and non-rival. The more transparent a government is, the better for everybody. And the fact that the transparency is benefiting citizen A doesn't take away from the benefit for citizen B. The same thing with the rule of law. The same thing with accountability. The same thing with effectiveness and efficiency, right? The more efficient a government is, the better for everybody, right? But it doesn't always happen because that's human nature, and that's what governments sometimes don't do what they should do. And so one way that we fix this is through legislation, whether it be state legislation or the Constitution, right? The Constitution requires that certain provisions or certain things be provided equally. The 14th Amendment, for example, requires due process and equal protection of the laws. So within that 14th Amendment protection, the government is required to provide certain things that it would normally not require if the Constitution did not require the state and the federal government to provide it. Okay, I think we're getting to the last two questions, and these questions go together. Okay, what determines an efficient supply of a pure public good? How is the efficient supply affected by the fact that taxes required to pay for the pure public good typically introduce distortions in the economy? All right, so The idea of taxes, and are they good, are they bad? Because we know that they produce welfare losses, right, and distortions. And then in what sense is efficient government a pure public good or a public good? Well, to answer these questions, right, we think about government or good government as an end in and of itself, not just a means to an end, but an end in and of itself, right? Taxes, some taxes are needed. We know that we need certain levels of taxation, and we need to tax certain things to move the market to the right allocation, the right product mix, right? Product mix efficiency, right? There's too much cigarettes in the market. We need to tax cigarette consumption to reduce it to the level that is appropriate. If we have not enough public housing, then we should provide more public housing because we don't want people to go homeless. So we perhaps might increase the allocation of the taxes for that, right? But increasing taxes is not necessarily an efficient action from government, right? The more efficient government is with our resources, the less it will need to increase taxes. And this may be counterintuitive, but if we think about how much money is spent on the bureaucracy that makes possible for the provision of these goods and services, the more efficient and the less bureaucratic and the less cumbersome these processes become, the more of that tax dollar will go to the citizen instead of going towards all of the bureaucracy that is required at times to keep these services going. We should rethink perhaps how we provide assistance for the needy. Maybe a lump sum, right? Instead of a welfare system, perhaps consider a system where you provide a lump sum to the citizen and then let the citizen invest that money in whatever he or she needs it for, right? Of course, this is not easier said than done, right? Because it doesn't guarantee that the citizen will do what needs to be done with the money, right? But again, the idea is that good government is an end in and of itself. We all want good governance. Good governance is a pure public good because the more good governance we have, the better our government is, the more efficient our government is, the better it will be for everybody in the economy, right? Okay, and then, so to summarize, last but not least, right, to summarize, we talked about, obviously, the public goods and the two properties of public goods, right? Public goods are non-excludable and non-rival in consumption, right? So those are the two key properties of public goods. Remember the role of private markets in providing pure public goods, right? Sometimes it is more efficient for the private market to provide a public good like education, right? Private education, right? Harvard and Princeton and MIT and all the private institutions in the United States are private institutions, but they're providing a public good, which is education. Now, is it a pure public good? No, because it is excludable, and it is, to some extent, rival in consumption. But the idea is that the more we provide it, and the government helping the private sector to provide it through private education, at some point, those individuals that are unable to initially benefit from it will at some point be able to benefit from it. Of course, it's not easy, right, to provide public goods because, as we said, the free rider problem always gets in the way, and it makes that efficient allocation and provision of goods and services very difficult and sometimes even impossible because you cannot exclude people from consuming a pure public good. right? And all of these conditions, right, when thought together, we can think about them in the context of Pareto efficiency, the idea proposed by Vilfredo Pareto that Pareto efficiency is a situation where you cannot make somebody better off without making somebody else worse off, right? So that's the general idea behind Pareto efficiency. And as I think about these concepts, I think there's perhaps the most important and one of the most important public goods, pure public goods that we can think of is faith. Okay, faith is non-excludable and non-rival in consumption. Right, our faith in God, my faith in God, does not exclude you or anybody from benefiting from your faith in God. And my faith in God does not rival in any way, shape, or form the benefits that you receive from having faith in God. So, I thought about a nice way to close this lecture, and I couldn't think of a better way than this way. That perhaps the perfect example of a pure public good is in fact our faith, and it is a wonderful good, and it's something that governments and society should strive to promote, because I think it generates tremendous positive externalities at all levels, right? So with that, I conclude today's lecture, and I hope you enjoyed it, and God bless you. Thank you.